and thank you for tuning in on Yachting International Radio. My name is Eva Lianne Veldkamp, and you are listening to Maritime Unity, the podcast where we talk about inclusion and safety and how the true meaning of it can change the world that we live in. Today we will talk with Craig Lindell about why it is important to create safe places for dialogue. And I have to say, Craig is one of my favorite persons to speak to ever. And hopefully you will notice this later on in this podcast episode. So first of all, hi, Craig. Thank you.
Hi, Eva. How are you? Good morning.
Yeah, I'm good. And I hope you're good as well. And thank you so much for being here today with us.
Pleasure.
Yeah. So first of all, can you give us a quick introduction about who you are and what you love to do most?
My current interests are water. I'm 78 years old. I'm passionate about, I'm a pathological workaholic, and I'm passionate about issues related to water because they are planetary issues. And I'm passionate about a new approach to dialogue that enables people to think as a group. And the background on me is quickly, I failed in school until I tested my IQ to be about 100, just over 100. My father basically said to me when I was failing in the 9th grade, that it was either prep school or vocational school. I asked, what's a prep school? He got me into a prep school by telling the headmaster he didn't think I was as stupid as I appeared to be. And I graduated third in my class. The first and second in my class went to Harvard and Yale, and I went to a little school called Bates, which is a remarkable undergraduate education, and graduated near the top of my class there and went on to the divinity school at Yale. But I had a remarkable teacher, and in 1968, he handed me a book called The Firmament of Time. It was one of the early environmental books. It was an intellectual history on how the world began to think about itself as natural. I read that book and went to lectures by a fellow named Ian McHarg, who was in the process of writing a book, published the next year, a book called Design with Nature. I decided that Western metaphysics was ecologically catastrophic, including Christianity, and I dropped out of theological school and went to work. Didn't do anything for 20 years except work, the operating level, built a business to $70 million and sold it. And as a minor partner, and got a chance to start over where I started a water business. But in the process, I had a midlife crisis because I had not gotten over the notion that I was intelligent. I didn't believe I was intelligent. I was in my 40s before I began to believe I was intelligent. That crisis is a very humbling experience. When you go to hell, I tell people I had the great good fortune of not being smart enough to resist my descent into hell. And when I came out of that, the intellectual curiosity with which I had been infected really at Bates came back, and I read a broad range of stuff, started a business in the water. I turned around a business and then started another business in wastewater treatment, which got me into the water sector. But I also had closed a factory in 1984, and I came home to a community that had lost 10,000 of its 50,000 jobs in 8 years, and nobody knew what to do. And I basically started a conversation saying, I don't know what to do either, but we know what we need to do, so I'll put myself in the service of anyone who has a good idea. That ended up being a community forum of 150 people, which over a 5-year period the forum did nothing but talk, but the groups that gathered there talked to each other, formed voluntary associations, and created possibilities that nobody in their wildest imaginations would have considered, like putting millions of dollars into trying to start the 4th largest aquarium in the world, filling wetlands in a waste cedar and a red maple swamp to get an extension to the airport, which we got funded. And for things that nobody considered possible, we did. And that ends up being the foundation of my interest in dialogue and in my interest in democracy, as I read to you just quickly before we started it, that I believe it's in the diversity of people and the plurality of their perspectives and the literacy of their lived experiences and the scope of their creative imaginations that we preserve democracy and generate novel and unforeseen opportunities. And I think the world, as it flirts with autocracy, is exhausted by, let me do it this way. I want to talk about the dialogue. The water piece is self-evident. You can look at what's going on at the UN and what's going on in the American Water Works Association in the United States, what's going on with the Water Commission that's coming out of Davos and the international business community, and see that we're on the edge of a shift in consciousness and values that I think is major in its proportion.
So let us just pause a little bit there, because I think a lot of people who are listening may be a little bit overwhelmed by hearing all of this amazing stuff. And I think I have always such a good time talking to you, because it's really about important things that concerns us all. And I think what I really wanted people to tell was how we meet. And while you were talking about how you started to be interested in dialogic design and also democratic dialogue, made me realize, because I never asked you this question, but I think my question was like, why were you interested in the work that I did together with all the people in the community I built on creating more awareness on psychological safety to address bullying and sexual assault and harassment in the maritime sector. And we just worked on that. And also we made a lot of media outages on that. And we talked about it with a lot of people, so the other people of the group, of course. And then we met up with you and all of your friends from this other community, which connected over this. And I still remember how amazed I was when I talked with all of you, because it was not so much regarding the subject itself, although it was still about water, by the way. So it's also the whole maritime sector is on the water, dealing with water. So that's also interesting. But it was also very nice to discover that what we were doing was actually so valuable to know, because when you are solving these problems we have, and these are so-called wicked problems, maybe you can also tell us something about that. Because when you are solving wicked, interrelated, multidimensional problems, also change in time and, having to do with so many other stuff.
Yep.
And it's very important to make connection with people around you and create a group of people that are able to listen to each other, that are able to share, that create safe space to feel inclusive enough to share your creativity and to be yourself also in this group, and then come up with these amazing ideas. And then to see that you can also action these ideas, as you just mentioned, really, really brightly, then if you're able to, then you can really change the world. So it's so nice to speak with you on this today. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about those wicked problems we are talking about.
Well, it's interesting in this respect. I'll do it quickly and give a couple of references. There's a document called The Predicament of Mankind. It was published in 1970. It's the first document of the Club of Rome, which rejected it as a potential thesis for extended work and elected to go with with what became the limits to growth, which was the MIT study that was published in 1972 and was an international bestseller, and set the stage for what 14 years later the UN Brundtland Commission defined as sustainable development. It was the first time we talked about dealing with limits. But what had happened is that the predicament of mankind was a much richer issue. The study looks at 49 enormous world problems, which, as they are described, are complex, intricately interrelated, inseparable, and therefore dangerous. And that emerged out of a thing called the Berkeley bubble, where Peter Drucker, the famous international social thinker and consultant, was with which he was familiar. And I'm going down a rabbit hole. I'm going to come right out. Drucker produced a book in 1968 that called the Age of Discontinuity, where he realized that the complexities with which we were going to be entering as going forward were not going to be addressed by the institutional structures that we had built, because we had built them on simple notions of expertise and scientific fact. And the corollary book at the same time was written by a fellow named Churchman called The Design of Inquiring Systems. One of the fellows, the team that put together the predicament of mankind, included a fellow named Alexander Christakis. When it was not selected by the Club of Rome for the major work, Osbekon, who wrote it, and you can look it up, The Predicament of Mankind, on Google, you'll find it, went to Wharton. And Christakis, who had been a freedom fighter in Greece and was a theoretical nuclear physicist with a PhD from Yale, took his mathematical and scientific skills and got involved in the math labs at George Mason University, where they were working on a concept called interpretive structural modeling, which in essence, in short strokes, is a root cause analysis approach to dialogue. And I should step back and tell you my first experience as I got invited into this, because it'll explain the issue. I was asked to go to Washington to speak to 50 senior people at the EPA on a different approach to wastewater. And 10 of us were going to speak. Then my colleague who was introducing me to this asked me what I was going to tell them. And I said, if they didn't shape demand, we wouldn't change the approach to water. I'm a business guy. That's what I would say. He said, what other influences do you think there might be? I said, if I'm a town, I'd say money. If I'm a regulator, I'd say mandates. If I'm a nonprofit, I'd say education. I came up with 8 or 9 of these things. So the idea is it's a root cause analysis. So it's a pairwise comparison. You ask the question, the process forces you, first of all, it records everything. So when you're working with a group, everybody's definition of what they meant is there and recorded. That comes very important later. So we go back and forth. If I significantly alter education, will I alter demand? If I significantly alter demand, will I alter education? If you do that, and you've got 10 items, then you've got 10 times 10 minus 10 questions. It's 90 questions. 2 things happen. Well, one, you can't track neurologically more than 7 plus or minus 2 linear relationships. We can't do it. So power can't influence the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. And the decisions are made by a group voting on a supermajority basis on what those influences are. So if it's a 50-50 split on the group, it's a no. It's not significantly influential. We finish the exercise and we get the influence map, and I look at the influence, and the fellow who's taking me through this says, so what do you think the deep driver is now? I said, I don't know. I can't follow all of this. It's got to be, I still think it's shaping demand. He hands me the influence map, and up in the left-hand corner, affecting nothing, is shaping demand. My considered opinion as an expert, I don't believe in experts, but that's why I was invited to Washington, was completely refuted by my taking a systematic approach to the problem. Now, what happens in most situations is when you ask people to vote on the pairwise comparison, their initial vote, and this is the learning curve you go through in the process, their initial vote is based on what they thought they heard the other person say, not on what the person meant. Okay. It's like kids whispering in a circle, and what comes out is not what went in. That happens all the time in adult conversations. We only hear through the filter of our own mind, and so we interpret it. And that interpretation corrupts authentic dialogue. So when you get over that and you get to the real meanings behind the comparisons and you start to compare them, then the group begins to work easier and easier together, and they begin to realize that they all make that mistakes. It's not like some people make them and others don't. It is a fact of our lives that corrupts most dialogue, even when we try to be collaborative, because we don't have a structure that disciplines us to do it. Most collaborative effort is facilitated by an expert in managing dialogue. In dialogic design, it is a facilitator who only worked the discipline of the group. He is not allowed to participate in the interpretations of the group. So what you get at the end is an influence map, not showing a yes or no like debate. It's not binary, it's complex. And it is a story that the group has told itself about the influences of all of their different opinions on each other and what they voted on as being the best map that they could give themselves on how to proceed. The map isn't a map. It's the foundation for a new narrative. So I like to say that the group, by thinking as a group, not individually in a group, but as a group, becomes conscious of that about which they were not yet conscious when they began. And in the process, they did it as a group. So they created a community in the process of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I just found out about what you just told us, it made me think most about a beehive, and then some bees act as an organism by itself, right? So if you're able to do that, then you can take your whole everything into a group or a community, and then you can just be part of that, and also be part of something greater, and also let the community itself create, like you said, an influence map. But that's not even an opinion, right? That's like
No, it's the work of the group.
Yeah.
It is the best thinking of the group that organized itself at the time to give them that about which they were not yet conscious when they started. Another group can take the same issue and answer it differently, and then you can compare the influence maps. So it's iterative.
It's like not the voice of a group, of a community.
Yeah, yes. And it's thoroughly documented, and it's iterative, so it's constantly subject to change. It's been used with the deaf to help to engage them in the process of how to educate them better. The fellow who created it, I told you he was a freedom fighter in Greece, before he became a theoretical nuclear physicist. His argument is that when the stakeholders are not involved in making the decisions about the institutions under which they're going to have to subject themselves, then you don't have democratic involvement.
Yes.
And
that's really, sorry for interrupting, because I really want to dive into that, because that's so important. Because the other day I was reading in a newspaper an article of somebody who wrote a book about poverty, and how all the policy, at least in my country, to address poverty and to make sure that people who have not enough or a lot of financial resources, or even intellectual resources, or any resources at all, or not a lot of privilege from who they are or what their past is. The policy to change this is made by people who actually didn't live this experience a lot of times.
Right.
So the policy for poor people is made by rich people. So you cannot understand poor people. You're not part of the community, but somehow you create the rules and regulations and also help programs to get help. It doesn't make any sense. So I was just thinking about, while you were saying this, how incredibly important this is to make sure that all the stakeholders are part of the decision making and are part of the democratic process this way. And so my question to you is, how do you make a safe place for this dialogue? Because on this podcast, we are talking a lot about inclusion and safety. And also from my experience, it can be really eye-opening and mind-blowing to have a lot of perspectives in the same room. So would you explain the coherency between inclusion and safety and having dialogue with each other?
That's what strikes me about your experience and your courage. That's why we have these conversations, because that dimension, I think, is two things are going on in our society. Those of us who are trying to open that dimension to the plurality of our lives, and those who are trying to close it to the narrowness of their interests. And it's happening all over the planet. And I think that comes out of the confusion of the times because our institutions haven't been able to cope with the complexity with which we're confronted. My task is not to practice it. I'm a sales guy, and I've been in business all my life. If you don't get an order, you can't validate the fact that you've got a business. So I have been trying to find a university home for it. One of the places it's institutionalized is in the Department of Education in Michigan. And the fellow who you met, Jeff, who's with that group, and he has access and has been able to update the original software that was done by Christakis. That group still meets every year. There'll be a small conference in Arcanis in Greece, which is his hometown, in Crete in October. But I get my head straight here because I go all over. I have ADD. I'm all over the place. So I have been working for 2 years and we have the interest of the dean and of the divinity school at Yale, which I dropped out of 50 some years ago, and the academic dean to integrate this process with their curriculum. We have several other theological seminaries that are interested in doing that. There's a group at Yale, a new group at Yale called Public Policy and Public Theology, which is chaired by a Black theologian. And that's more into the public policy realm, which the school is getting involved with. And I have had a conversation with a PhD policeman who in his retirement got his PhD after being chiefs of police in God knows how many cities. He now runs a group of policemen as an adjunct support system to the police department in New York City, and they are practicing their police work without guns. Mm-hmm. And he's interested in using the process to explore that further. So the idea is, can our generation, I'm 78, most of us are in our 70s who practice this, can our generation find a way to institutionalize it in a major academic institution from which it can be practiced, taught, and researched? Right now, you can use about 35 to 50 people with 100 different perspectives, and the process works, which is broad. To emphasize your point, though, I wanted to make the point that it was used with indigenous farmers, illiterate indigenous farmers in Mexico, where the Department of Agriculture in Mexico wanted to see if it could improve the practices of the indigenous Mexican farmers. But the subtlety of their farming was so refined that they concluded after 3 or 4 days of working with the dialogue process that there was nothing the Department of Agriculture could do to improve the efficiency of farming with the indigenous Mexican farmers who were illiterate. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, very. And also it gives an indication about how value cannot always be seen with the eye of the Western, how do you say that? With the Western view, we tend to hold on to sometimes.
Oh, and of the failures of expertise and scientific thought that we thought, which is the Enlightenment heritage, which is dying around us. I'm not sure I finished the comment, but the idea that we thought science would increase our control over nature, that technology would improve our quality of life, and reason would give us good government, which we assumed in the early 1960s and 70s. By the 1990s, we knew none of that was true.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And that failure has thrown democracies into chaos.
Yeah.
And it's not a failure of democracy or the people. It's a failure of the assumptions that we make about how we make our decisions.
Exactly. And it's such a blind spot. And it takes a lot to recognize this blind spot in yourself, right? And then you need to be strong enough to observe your own humbleness in this, I think, because this is what you believe to be true and will save our humankind or something. But yeah, it's not.
Yeah. It was an epiphany for me to realize that I changed the whole focus of our business based on the decision that it wasn't a demand-driven world. It actually was a trust-driven world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so nice to talk about this with you because it makes your mind goes into all kinds of things that it's applicable to, right? So I would love to talk with you further on this. But I think for now, we talked a little bit already about this, why it's important to create safe spaces for dialogue. And also, thank you very much for explaining a little bit more about democratic dialogue and what it entails. And I hope that everybody who is listening can follow it. But of course, you can listen it back. And also, if you have questions, then please comment or please send us a message, because we are more than happy to answer all of your questions.
To respond, yes.
Or respond. So just for closing out, I wanted to ask you this question. And I am asking this question to all of the guests on my show. I'm making a podcast here on Yachting International Radio because my biggest wish is for all of us to see and recognize the human kindness within ourselves and the other, so that we can make true connections and wise decisions. Because this has the power to transform our reality, right? And the beautiful world that surrounds us. So my question to you is, what makes you feel human and a part of humankind?
As I was chatting earlier, Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay on the American Scholar, said he would better rather never read a book than be warped by its content clear out of his own orbit. The only thing of real value was what he called the active soul. None of us know what the soul is. It is that mystery. People like Carl Jung get close to it when they talk about the collective unconscious. We are dealing with issues of consciousness now that are really on the edge of things. Johns Hopkins work with drugs and so forth to open up the vistas of the unconscious. I like to focus on what I call the not yet conscious, which is what makes design dialogue so interesting. To me, it is somewhere in the mystery between that not yet conscious, unconscious soul and the active and the disciplines of an active mind that resists certainty and is constantly asking itself the next question. That's the times we're in. And to me, those are exciting vistas between consciousness and the not yet conscious. And that's what keeps me going. The more I do that, the more I'm grateful for the brief interval of time I have called life.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for this wonderful answer. And it was wonderful to have you on the show today. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you for the opportunity. Take care.
Yeah, thank you all the listeners for your time also. I hope you learned a little bit more about inclusion and safety and everything we talked about today. Please feel free to share if you learned something in the comments below. And before we say goodbye, please remember to be grateful to the earth and open to the universe. Tot ziens and see you on the next episode.